Okay, so we've read this chapter. Any number of us might be thinking, what on earth is going on here? It sounds like people were being pressured to end their marriages. It sounds like people were being pressured out of their marriages. And if that's the idea swirling in our minds, this passage does seem a little bit grim or even draconian. That said, I am going to suggest to you today this passage is not as grim or as draconian as we might first imagine. And if nothing else, this passage does make the point that every Christian needs to hear. This passage speaks to a point that each and every one of us needs to hear, and it is this, that sin is serious and it needs a serious solution. Sin is dreadfully serious and it does need a serious solution. That said, what is going on in this chapter? Why were people being told to end their marriages to foreigners? At the outset, I do need you to know that this is not a proof text of the Bible which forbids intercultural or interethnic marriages. This is not what this text is about. Indeed, there are notable marriages in the Bible which were intercultural and interethnic. We might think about Moses marrying a dark-skinned woman named Zipporah, or we might think about Boaz marrying Ruth, a widow from a culturally different context than his own. But what made the marriages of Moses and Zipporah, even Boaz and Ruth, so praiseworthy was their common faith in God. That is, they had a shared commitment, a shared conviction about the God that they were going to worship. That is what made their marriages so praiseworthy. The problem that Ezra was dealing with was completely opposite to those praiseworthy examples. Some people of Ezra's day were entering marriages or simply cohabitated with spouses and partners who continued to worship foreign gods. That's the situation Ezra has to deal with. This practice amongst God's people amounted to a testimony that they were simply no longer interested, attentive, nor caring what God said about marriage. And that was, what God said about marriage to Israel was, do not take for yourselves husbands and wives who worshipped foreign gods. So Ezra knew this problem was very serious. And if he left this problem unaddressed, it would dilute the faithfulness, the identity, and the mission of God's people like a pair of jeans that's been through the wash too many times, that you simply don't know what color it was supposed to be. So it was with God's people, who entered into marriages and living arrangements with those who had mixed and contradictory religious commitments. By letting this practice slide under the radar, it would eventually become harder and harder for us to tell, and for Ezra to tell, if God's people were actually serious about their commitment to God. If they won't obey him in this area, eventually they're not going to obey him in any area. And that just means they don't know who they are anymore. It becomes undiscernible whether they are still God's people or not. And this was a very serious problem. And in the previous chapter, Ezra made this heart-wrenching confession of this sin to God. But the question Ezra now needs to deal with, and what he needs to think about, is this. I've made the confession of the sin, but now what are we going to do about the sin practically? What is Israel going to do in order to get rid of this sin amongst the body? And that is a really big question for us. It's a really big question to consider, and it has some really big implications. Fortunately, Ezra doesn't have to think about this question and provide an answer all on his own. He's not a one-man band. He doesn't have to think through a solution all by himself. In verse 1, it told us that a good number of people saw the problem just as Ezra did. And then in verses 2 to 3, which I'm going to read for us in full, sets the scene for us and what we're going to consider for the rest of this morning. So verses 2 and 3. Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, the son of Elam, addressed Ezra. We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now, there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. You know, as we read this, it does make some of us dreadfully uncomfortable, doesn't it? That this is the solution being offered: to separate from your wives and from the children. Perhaps the picture in our minds is that of a heartless divorce process presided over by the religious elite for anyone who was caught up in a marriage of mixed religion. And then we wonder what this might mean for us today. Perhaps we did marry someone with a differing conviction about religion, and so we're wondering whether divorce is the thing that God expects from us as well. I'll deal with these questions of application a little bit later on. But for now, I do want to say this. The text itself doesn't give us a clear picture of how this proposal to put away the spouses that worshipped other gods was specifically applied. And this leaves out the nitty-gritty details. And it leaves us to speculate on questions like, were the unbelieving spouses simply pushed to the curb with suitcase in hand in a cold and heartless fashion? Could spouses return to their fathers or other family connections? Were any of these spouses afforded any ongoing support? And what about the children caught up in all of this? Did they get to spend time with mum and dad as they grew up? These are the kinds of questions that come to mind. And sadly, we don't have any detailed answers in the text. But what the text does clearly tell us is this: amongst God's people, there was a serious sin, and it really did require a serious solution. There was a serious sin among God's people, and it required a serious solution. And without this corporate, this everybody on board response, this sin would continue to seek and find an unfaithful people who would welcome it. If the whole church in the Old Testament, if all of Ezra's people, if all the people who said that they worship God weren't prepared to deal with this collectively, that sin would continue to find little pockets, groups of people within the community who would welcome it, who would accept it, and who would normalize it, and who would find celebrants who would affirm this arrangement of couples living together even though they worshipped different gods. That is simply one way that sin survives. It finds a safe haven among a group of people who are vague, spiritually vague or vacant, and who will accept or at least refuse to address an obvious sin in their midst. That's how sin finds oxygen to keep going in a community. The author, Jerry Bridges, called these sins, these normalized sins, even within the Christian community, respectable sins. When the Christian community or the believing community gives breathing room for sin, he calls these sins respectable sins. Sins that no one wants to deal with. Sins that no one wants to talk about. Sins that we quietly tolerate and slowly become okay with. Bridges pulled no punches and named all kinds of potential respectable sins in the Christian community. Discontentment, unthankfulness, pride, selfishness, lack of self-control, anger, sins of the tongue. And he goes on and on. And as is typical of Bridges, he made his point with this graciously convicting insight. He said, we, the believing community, can readily identify sin in the immoral and unethical conduct of people in society at large. But we often fail to see it in what I call the acceptable sins of the saints. Surely this could have described what was happening in Ezra's day, couldn't it? That the sin had simply become an acceptable and a respectable sin within the community of God's people. God's people had been, after all, remember, they had been released from exile. They had been returned to their land. They had rebuilt their temple. They had revitalized their worship. They had rejoiced in a taste of faithfulness toward God. From their perspective, perhaps it started to look like sin was simply a thing that was out there among the pagan nations. But given all their blessings and all their spiritual renewal that they were experiencing, they couldn't see the sin within their own community. Perhaps this is why this respectable sin of religiously mixed marriage took hold for as long as it did. It found a safe haven, a foothold, while no one was looking and no one was willing to say anything. As such, it had become a serious sin and it needed a serious solution. And a serious solution is exactly what Ezra offered the community in verse 10. He asked the whole community to implement the serious solution. It says that Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, that's everyone who gathered, the guilty as well as the innocent, you have broken faith and married foreign women and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now then, make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. Notice these two elements. Notice these two things. The whole community was summoned to confess the sin verbally, and the whole community was summoned to deal with the sin practically. There were words and there were actions. There was a verbal confession and there was a practical application. Both are very necessary if anyone is going to make way and eradicate a sin within a community of God's people. We need to confess it communally and we need to deal with it communally through actions. Yet this public and corporate solution to divide couples seems like an overkill to us. That is the difficult thing for many of us and perhaps our friends and our neighbors who are encountering this text for the first time. That's the difficult thing to get over. That the religious leaders of God's people in the Old Testament said to the community, divorce. And we can't get our heads around that. It just seems too much. It seems like an overkill of a solution. And this is largely because we tend to think of sin as a private and an individual matter that needs to be dealt with privately and individually. But sin is insidious. It spreads. Hence the Bible's admonition, do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Sin just infects. It spreads. It might start off as a private and an individual matter, but it's insidious. It spreads itself amongst a people. For this reason, it takes a whole community to tackle a serious sin with a serious solution. Collectively, they must take ownership of this problem. And this, I think, explains why Ezra called this meeting with such force and energy as he did in verse 8. I mean, think about it. Ezra summoned everyone to a congregational meeting in Jerusalem under this great threat. If anyone did not come within 3 days, by order of the officials and the elders, all his property shall be forfeited, and he himself banned from the congregation of the exiles. Imagine getting that email. If you don't attend this meeting, all your stuff, everything that you own is forfeited, and you cannot be part of the church anymore. That's heavy, right? I mean, that's the kind of meeting that's really hard to ignore. And so we have to ask the question, why the heavy hand, Ezra? Why such a heavy hand? Because in Ezra's eyes, if those who identify themselves as God's people wouldn't deal with this exposed sin, they will forfeit their membership in the community of God's people. It's not a joke. The sin is terrifyingly serious. And I know that kind of sounds real serious and severe and demanding and perhaps over the top, especially to those of us who are on high alert to be as tolerant as is humanly possible and to tiptoe our way around sin so as not to make anyone feel uncomfortable. And I'm guilty of this too. I am affected by this cultural zeitgeist, pressuring me not to deal with sin. But sobering moments when sin is exposed and afforded the opportunity to be dealt with are unavoidable as a follower of Jesus. It might be uncomfortable, but it is unavoidable when a sin becomes exposed and we have to deal with it. That is because, as a follower of Jesus, I come to learn that Jesus himself took a serious view of sin. And like Ezra, he too went after sin amongst those who want to be known as God's people. Jesus, like Ezra, goes after sin among the people who wants to be known as God's people. Remember, Jesus said these words. He said, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That's pretty severe, isn't it? If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It seems like Ezra had a similarly serious view of sin and offered a similarly serious solution. That is the big lesson of chapter 10. Sin is serious, and it does require a serious solution. So let me speak for a moment to those of us who at first found this text with its insistence on dissolving marriages of religiously diverse couples to be draconian, heartless, cruel, harsh, unkind. You pick your own word for it. If you thought this was simply over the top of the scriptures to talk this way, let me speak to you for a minute. True, it may have sounded really harsh to you as you first read it. But once we gain some understanding of how serious the problem really was, and that sin left unaddressed, even normalized and accepted amongst the community of God's people, it will eventually betray their love for God. If you leave the sin alone, if you don't touch it, if you don't deal with it, it will eventually consume the people, and it will betray their love for God. And once you see that, you might come to see how appropriate a serious response to sin really is. This all points us to Jesus, of course. That the most serious and the most needful solution to sin ever devised had come from God, who offered his Son as an atoning sacrifice for sin. Nothing less serious would do. And more than putting away a foreign spouse, God put his beloved Son away, as his Son cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as he laid down his life for those he loves. Sin is serious enough to warrant a serious solution. And no solution is more serious than Christ's sacrifice. He did this to break the power and the penalty associated with sin, and as one of his disciples said, to bring us to God, to make us a holy nation for God's own possession. So I commend this Jesus to you, and like Ezra, I summon you to believe and entrust yourself to his serious solution for sin. As we close the series then, I want to address some of the practical applications and the objections we might still have about this chapter. Ezra told us those who married or cohabitated with those outside of the faith, that they are to put their spouses away, to separate from them, which implies divorce and estrangement. And the question is, was that needlessly cruel? Was that a needlessly cruel imposition? Before I answer, I do need you to remember that these marriages weren't these sweet, playful, charming relationships celebrated on shows like Dharma and Greg. Some of you are just too young to know that show. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't that playful and delightful kind of banter of, hey, we believe different things, but we know how to get along and overcome our difficulties. These marriages and living arrangements were costly to God's people. Namely, these marriages near always corrupted God's people and eroded their love for God. And as God solemnly warned them, he said, "You shall not intermarry with people of foreign religion, because they would turn you away and serve other gods." Don't intermarry outside the faith, because eventually they'll turn you away and you'll end up serving other gods. That is why the sin required such a serious solution. But because the text is also silent on the finer details of application, we could only speculate what the exact details of obedience may have looked like. More than likely, marriages in violation of God's command ended in divorce, and illegitimate living arrangements would have been put to an end. And though the process, even this said, that it is detrimental, it is a determinative step that they have to take. Even that said, it may not have been the bloodbath that we might imagine. Remember, according to verses 16 to 17, those charged to investigate these conflicting marriages took time to examine each marriage carefully. And by running the numbers, we can deduce the following, that the investigation took something like 75 days to do. 75 days to have a look at these marriages that could possibly fall foul of God's word. And then there was only found 110 violating marriages. Amongst the tens of thousands of people that belong to Israel, there is only found 110 violating marriages. So none of this, keep this in mind, none of this happened in a rapid afternoon of religious fervor. Great care was taken to be exacting with justice, and this would have been the equivalent of delicate keyhole surgery to cut sin out from a body of people. That is simply to say, great care was taken so that it wouldn't turn into this sporadic bloodbath where the innocent would have fallen under the hammer of justice. Nor do we detect a room for genuine converts. There's nothing in the text that says that, look, if you married someone outside the faith and they converted during that marriage, that marriage was spared. More than likely that marriage would have been spared, correct? Right? You're both believing in the same God now. Some of them may have married a disbeliever who in time converted, and the New Testament does envisage such a prospect. That during the course of the marriage, one spouse becomes a believer in the hope that the other would follow. And 1 Peter 3 speaks to women in situations exactly like this. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. The New Testament does envisage a situation where a spouse is the instrument of bringing the other to saving faith in Christ. That said, there may be other questions you have about the application and objections that you may still have about this text that I have not addressed this morning. I welcome and extend an invitation to you to come and talk. And hopefully we can learn together. But don't miss the major point of chapter 10. Sin is serious, and it needed a serious solution. Ultimately, Jesus is that serious solution and calls us, his people, to separate ourselves from the world of sin and to live to righteousness. Let's pray.